What do military commanders say when they realize their greatest strategic gamble has failed catastrophically? What words pass between generals when they watch their army not merely defeated, but fundamentally broken? In the winter of 1943, as the Red Army continued its relentless advance westward after the annihilation of the Sixth Army at Stalingrad, Germany's top military leadership found themselves confronting a reality that shattered their assumptions about warfare, their enemy, and their own invincibility. The conversations, dispatches, diary entries, and strategic assessments produced by German generals in the months following Stalingrad reveal a fascinating evolution from denial to desperate improvisation, from arrogance to grudging respect, and ultimately from strategic confidence to the first whispers of inevitable defeat. These were not ordinary military setbacks being discussed in hushed conference rooms and coded communications. Stalingrad had consumed an entire field army, approximately 250,000 men, along with irreplaceable equipment, experienced commanders, and the psychological foundation upon which the Wehrmacht's Eastern campaign had been built. When the Red Army did not pause to consolidate, but instead pressed forward with multiple offensives across the Eastern Front, German military leadership faced a crisis that transcended tactics or operational planning. They confronted the possibility that everything they believed about the Soviet Union, its military capabilities, and the fundamental nature of the war might have been catastrophically wrong. The private communications and discussions among Germany's generals during this period provide remarkable insight into how military professionals rationalize failure, how institutional cultures respond to trauma, and how ideological commitments can blind even experienced commanders to battlefield realities. These documents reveal tensions between Hitler and his military leadership, disagreements among generals themselves about how to respond to the Soviet offensives, and the gradual recognition that the war in the East had fundamentally changed. What Germany's top generals said when the Red Army kept advancing after Stalingrad tells us not just about military history, but about human psychology under extreme stress, about the difficulty of abandoning cherished beliefs even when evidence demands it, and about how organizations navigate the gap between their narratives and reality. The German invasion of the Soviet Union, Operation Barbarossa, launched on June 22, 1941, had been predicated on several key assumptions. German military planning expected that the Red Army would collapse within weeks, that the Soviet Union lacked the industrial capacity to sustain prolonged warfare, and that Stalin's regime would crumble under military pressure. These assumptions were not baseless fantasies, but were grounded in Germany's experience in World War I, observations of the Soviet performance in the Winter War against Finland, and the devastating effects of Stalin's purges on the Red Army officer corps in the late 1930s. The initial phases of Barbarossa seemed to confirm German expectations. Entire Soviet armies were encircled and destroyed in massive battles of annihilation. Millions of Red Army soldiers were killed or captured. By December 1941, German forces stood at the gates of Moscow, having advanced hundreds of miles into Soviet territory. Yet Moscow did not fall, and the Red Army, though battered and bleeding, did not collapse. The winter counteroffensive of 1941-1942 pushed German forces back from the Soviet capital, demonstrating that the Wehrmacht was not invincible and that the Red Army possessed greater resilience than German intelligence had assessed. The 1942 campaign season saw Germany shift its strategic focus southward toward the oil fields of the Caucasus and the industrial city of Stalingrad on the Volga River. This operation, initially designated Case Blue, aimed to capture Soviet oil resources while cutting the vital Volga supply route. The decision to simultaneously push toward the Caucasus and Stalingrad created a strategic overextension that would prove fatal. As German forces became fixated on capturing Stalingrad in brutal urban combat throughout the fall of 1942, Soviet planners prepared Operation Uranus, a massive counteroffensive designed to encircle the German Sixth Army and its allies in the city. Operation Uranus launched on November 19, 1942, achieving complete surprise and rapidly encircling approximately 250,000 Axis troops in Stalingrad. German command faced a critical decision. Should the Sixth Army attempt to break out, or should it hold position while relief forces fought through to it? Hitler ordered the army to hold, promising that Hermann Göring's Luftwaffe would supply the encircled troops by air. This promise proved impossible to fulfill. The airlift delivered only a fraction of the supplies needed, and relief attempts failed to break through Soviet lines. On February 2, 1943, the remnants of the Sixth Army surrendered, marking the largest German defeat of the war to that point. The significance of Stalingrad extended far beyond the immediate military losses. The battle had consumed Germany's strategic reserve for the 1942-1943 campaign season. The destruction of entire Romanian, Italian, and Hungarian armies alongside German forces strained Axis alliances and exposed the vulnerability of Germany's coalition partners. Most critically, Stalingrad demonstrated that the Red Army had evolved tactically and operationally, capable of conducting complex offensive operations that German commanders had believed beyond Soviet capabilities. What shocked German military leadership was not merely that Stalingrad had been lost, but that the Red Army immediately exploited the victory. Rather than pausing to rest and refit after the enormous effort of encircling and destroying the Sixth Army, Soviet forces launched a series of offensives across the southern front. Operation Little Saturn struck toward Rostov, threatening to cut off German Army Group A in the Caucasus. Simultaneous offensives targeted Kursk, Kharkov, and other key positions. The Red Army demonstrated an operational tempo and strategic ambition that German planning had not anticipated. German forces found themselves conducting a fighting withdrawal across hundreds of miles of winter terrain, abandoning positions and equipment and improvising defensive lines with depleted units. The orderly, controlled warfare that German doctrine emphasized gave way to chaos as headquarters lost contact with forward units, supply lines collapsed, and commanders made desperate decisions with incomplete information. The professional German officer corps, trained in the Prussian tradition of military excellence, faced the humiliating reality that they were being consistently outmaneuvered by an enemy they had been taught to despise as inferior. The period from February through March 1943 represented the crisis point of the German war in the East. Field Marshal Erich von Manstein's counteroffensive, which recaptured Kharkov and stabilized the southern front, provided temporary relief and would later be held up by some German commanders as evidence that proper tactics could still contain the Soviets. However, this tactical success could not obscure the strategic reality that Germany had lost the initiative and would never fully regain it. The conversations and communications among German generals during this period reveal their struggle to comprehend this new reality. The international context of early 1943 also weighed on German strategic thinking. Allied forces had achieved victory in North Africa, threatening invasion of Italy. The Battle of the Atlantic was turning against German U-boats. Strategic bombing of German cities was intensifying. Japan, Germany's Pacific ally, had been checked at Midway and was increasingly on the defensive. German generals recognized that they faced a multi-front war against enemies whose combined industrial capacity far exceeded Germany's. The loss of Stalingrad occurred within this broader context of Germany's deteriorating strategic position across all theaters. In the immediate aftermath of Stalingrad's fall, German military communications reveal a leadership struggling to process the magnitude of the disaster. Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel, chief of the Armed Forces High Command, issued directives that seemed to exist in an alternate reality from the battlefield situation. His communications to field commanders emphasized the need to maintain defensive positions and predicted that spring weather would allow Germany to regain the initiative. These directives carefully avoided any analysis of why Stalingrad had fallen or what it meant for German strategic prospects. General Kurt Zeitzler, chief of the Army General Staff, took a somewhat more realistic view in his private communications, though his official reports remained optimistic. In conversations recorded by subordinates, Zeitzler expressed frustration with Hitler's refusal to authorize timely retreats, arguing that the Sixth Army could have been saved if allowed to break out when encirclement first occurred. However, Zeitzler framed Stalingrad as a failure of decision-making, rather than a fundamental problem with German strategic assumptions. He maintained that proper tactics and operational flexibility could still achieve victory in the East. Field Marshal Erich von Manstein, commanding Army Group Don, provided perhaps the most sophisticated German analysis of the post-Stalingrad situation. In reports to Hitler and communications with other senior commanders, Manstein acknowledged that the Red Army had demonstrated unexpected operational skill in encircling the Sixth Army. He noted that Soviet forces were employing mobile warfare tactics that resembled German methods, using tank formations and mechanized infantry to penetrate deeply and rapidly. However, Manstein argued that these Soviet successes resulted from German overextension rather than from any fundamental Soviet superiority. Manstein's assessment emphasized that Germany retained advantages in tactical excellence, leadership quality, and soldier training. He proposed a strategy of elastic defense, allowing Soviet forces to advance into overextended positions where German mobile reserves could strike their flanks and destroy them in counter-offensives. This approach, Manstein argued, would bleed the Red Army while conserving German strength. His successful recapture of Kharkov in March 1943 seemed to vindicate this approach, and Manstein's reports took on a tone of cautious optimism, suggesting that the crisis had passed. General Heinz Guderian, at this time serving as Inspector General of Armored Troops rather than in field command, offered a different perspective focused on material factors. In memoranda to Hitler and other leaders, Guderian emphasized Germany's declining tank production relative to Soviet output. He noted that while German tanks might be qualitatively superior, the Soviets were producing them in vastly greater numbers. Guderian argued that without a dramatic increase in German industrial production, numerical superiority would eventually overwhelm German tactical skills. His warnings, while prescient, were largely dismissed by other generals who remained confident in the superiority of German training and tactics. Colonel General Heinz Guderian's concerns about material production were echoed in different form by officers responsible for logistics. Quartermasters and supply officers produced increasingly alarmed reports about the difficulty of maintaining German forces in the field. The rapid Soviet advance had disrupted German supply lines, and the improvisations necessary to keep armies functioning consumed resources at unsustainable rates. These logistical reports, however, rarely reached the highest levels of command with their full urgency intact. Mid-level officers softened the language, aware that bearers of bad news faced career consequences or worse. One remarkable aspect of German military communications in this period is what they did not discuss. There is virtually no evidence of senior German generals questioning the fundamental strategic logic of the Eastern Campaign itself. None suggested that Germany should seek a negotiated peace or acknowledge that defeating the Soviet Union might be impossible. Instead, discussions focused on tactical adjustments, operational improvements, and material requirements. The possibility that Germany had embarked on an unwinnable war remained unspoken, perhaps unthinkable, even as evidence accumulated that the strategic situation was deteriorating. The generals' communications also reveal interesting patterns of blame distribution. Hitler was criticized, but carefully and privately, for specific decisions like ordering the Sixth Army to hold at Stalingrad or refusing to authorize retreats. However, the broader strategic framework that Hitler had imposed received less scrutiny. German coalition partners, Romanians, Italians, Hungarians, were frequently blamed for the collapse of flanks that enabled Soviet breakthroughs, with German reports emphasizing their allies' poor training, inadequate equipment, and lack of fighting spirit. This blame deflection allowed German generals to maintain their belief in Wehrmacht superiority while explaining away failures. Soviet capabilities were acknowledged but carefully circumscribed. German reports noted that the Red Army had improved its coordination, that Soviet tank production had increased, and that Stalin's commanders were learning from earlier mistakes. However, these acknowledgements were typically followed by reassurances that German forces remained tactically superior and that Soviet successes resulted from numerical superiority rather than genuine military excellence. The possibility that Soviet commanders might actually outthink their German counterparts was rarely entertained in official communications. The psychological impact of Stalingrad on German military culture cannot be overstated. For nearly 2 years, the Wehrmacht had been presented to German soldiers and the world as an invincible force. Individual battles might be lost, temporary setbacks might occur, but ultimate German victory was portrayed as inevitable. Stalingrad shattered this mythology. The surrender of an entire field army, including a field marshal who chose captivity over death, contradicted everything German military culture claimed about honor, duty, and fighting spirit. Communications from field commanders noted declining morale and increasing skepticism among troops about ultimate victory. The propaganda efforts to explain Stalingrad to the German public and military also reveal the leadership's psychological state. Rather than honestly assessing what had gone wrong, official statements portrayed Stalingrad as a heroic last stand that had tied down Soviet forces and prevented greater disasters elsewhere. This narrative served domestic morale purposes, but prevented honest evaluation of military performance. German generals, receiving these propaganda messages alongside battlefield reports, had to navigate between official narrative and operational reality, a cognitive dissonance that complicated strategic planning. As the Red Army continued advancing through February and March 1943, German military communications took on an increasingly desperate tone. Reports from field commanders described armies that were exhausted, under strength, and struggling to maintain cohesion while conducting fighting withdrawals. The romantic notion of orderly, controlled retreat gave way to the reality of chaos, panic, and disintegration of unit discipline. General Hans Valentin Huber, who had commanded elements of the Sixth Army and escaped the Stalingrad encirclement by air, provided one of the more honest assessments of German capabilities in conversations with other officers. Huber described demoralized soldiers who no longer believed in ultimate victory, officers who had lost confidence in their high command, and a growing sense that the war in the East had become unwinnable. His reports emphasized the psychological damage of Stalingrad, noting that soldiers who had previously believed the Wehrmacht invincible now questioned whether they would survive to see Germany again. Field reports from Army Group Center described Soviet offensives that were pushing German forces out of positions they had held for over a year. Officers noted that their armies were bleeding strength through constant combat without opportunity to rest or refit. The replacement system that had kept German divisions at acceptable strength levels throughout 1941 and 1942 could no longer keep pace with casualties. Units that had been at full strength in summer 1942 now operated at 50 or 60% of authorized personnel, with green replacements filling gaps left by dead and wounded veterans. Communications between field commanders and higher headquarters increasingly focused on requests for permission to retreat to more defensible positions. These requests were frequently denied by Hitler, who insisted that German forces hold every meter of ground. When retreats were authorized, they often came too late, after Soviet forces had already begun encircling German positions. This pattern repeated across the front, with field commanders growing increasingly frustrated at orders that seemed disconnected from battlefield reality. Colonel General Hermann Hoth, commanding the 4th Panzer Army, produced detailed after-action reports analyzing Soviet tactical improvements. Hoth noted that Red Army forces were employing sophisticated deception operations, creating the impression of attacks in one sector while concentrating forces elsewhere. Soviet artillery preparation had become more effective, with improved targeting and concentration of fire. Soviet infantry tactics had evolved from the human wave attacks of 1941 to more sophisticated combined arms operations, utilizing armor, infantry, and artillery in coordinated fashion. General Walter Model, commanding various armies and army groups throughout this period, developed a reputation for aggressive defense and counterattack. Model's communications emphasized the importance of holding key terrain and launching immediate counterattacks against Soviet penetrations. His reports took a notably different tone from Manstein's emphasis on elastic defense, arguing instead for rigid defense combined with local counteroffensives. Model's approach found favor with Hitler, who preferred commanders willing to fight for every position rather than those advocating strategic withdrawals. The tension between different strategic philosophies created friction within German command. Manstein's advocates argued for trading space for time, conducting mobile defense that preserved German forces while bleeding the Soviets. Model's approach prioritized holding ground and maintaining defensive lines, even at high cost. These debates played out in staff meetings and written communications, with proponents of each approach marshalling battlefield evidence to support their positions. Hitler's general preference for Model's aggressive defense gradually marginalized Manstein's more flexible approach. General Gotthard Heinrici, commanding various corps and armies on the Eastern Front, provided particularly insightful analysis of Soviet offensive patterns in his reports and diary entries. Heinrici noted that Soviet forces had learned to concentrate overwhelming force at points of attack, achieving local superiority even when Germans held overall numerical parity. He observed that Soviet reconnaissance had improved dramatically, with Red Army forces demonstrating detailed knowledge of German positions and defensive preparations. Heinrici's assessments painted a picture of an enemy that was learning and adapting faster than German forces could respond. Logistics reports from this period make grim reading. Supply officers documented the collapse of German logistics networks as Soviet advances overran supply dumps, severed rail lines, and forced constant displacement of rear area installations. The German army had been designed for rapid offensive operations with relatively short supply lines, not for sustained defensive warfare across vast distances. As German forces fell back, they left behind equipment that could not be evacuated, further weakening their combat power. Reports documented the abandonment of thousands of vehicles, hundreds of artillery pieces, and vast quantities of ammunition and supplies. The Luftwaffe's communications during this period reveal their own crisis. German air power, which had been crucial to early victories in the Soviet Union, was increasingly unable to provide the support that ground forces required. Air units were spread thin across multiple fronts, aircraft production lagged behind losses, and fuel shortages limited operational tempo. Most critically, Soviet air power had grown dramatically, with the Red Air Force now capable of contesting German air superiority and providing effective ground support to Soviet offensives. Luftwaffe officers reported with frustration that they could no longer guarantee air cover for German ground forces. Communications also reveal the human cost of constant retreat. Medical officers reported overwhelming numbers of casualties, including increasing cases of frostbite, exhaustion, and psychological breakdown. Field hospitals were overrun by the pace of Soviet advance, forcing the abandonment of wounded who could not be evacuated. These reports, sanitized for higher command, nonetheless conveyed the desperation of German medical personnel trying to care for casualties under impossible conditions. The wounded who fell into Soviet hands faced uncertain fates, and German soldiers increasingly fought with the knowledge that capture might mean death or disappearance into the Gulag system. The winter conditions of early 1943 compounded military difficulties. German forces were conducting retreats in sub-zero temperatures through deep snow with inadequate winter equipment. Frostbite casualties sometimes exceeded combat casualties in certain units. Vehicles broke down in extreme cold, and those that continued operating consumed fuel at accelerated rates. Reports describe soldiers suffering from exposure, malnutrition, and disease, alongside combat wounds. The physical toll of winter warfare under retreat conditions devastated German combat effectiveness. Communications from this period also revealed tensions between different branches of the Wehrmacht. Army commanders complained that the Luftwaffe was not providing adequate air support. Luftwaffe officers responded that unrealistic demands from ground forces failed to account for fuel shortages, numerical inferiority, and the improved Soviet air defense. SS units, which operated with some autonomy from regular Wehrmacht command, were sometimes described in army reports as refusing to coordinate or follow orders from army commanders. These inter-service frictions complicated defensive operations. By late spring 1943, German military leadership had moved beyond immediate crisis management to consider how to regain strategic initiative. The successful Kharkov counteroffensive had temporarily stabilized the front and provided breathing space for planning. German generals engaged in extensive debate about how to proceed, with these discussions revealing fundamental disagreements about Germany's strategic situation. The planning for Operation Citadel, the summer 1943 offensive against the Kursk salient, brought these disagreements into sharp focus. Manstein and other field commanders advocated for the operation, arguing that a successful offensive would restore German prestige, destroy significant Soviet forces, and potentially set conditions for a favorable negotiated peace. Guderian opposed Citadel, arguing that Germany lacked the resources for major offensive operations and that any attack would consume tank reserves needed for defensive operations. Model expressed reservations, noting that extensive Soviet defensive preparations would make breakthrough difficult. The communications surrounding Citadel planning reveal the degree to which German strategy had become reactive. Rather than seeking to impose their will on the Soviets through offensive action, German generals were essentially responding to Soviet operational success by trying to replicate earlier German victories. The hope was that a successful encirclement operation at Kursk would parallel earlier German successes and demonstrate that the Wehrmacht still possessed offensive capability. This hope, however, was built on questionable assumptions about relative combat power and Soviet defensive capabilities. Intelligence assessments presented to German leadership before Citadel painted a concerning picture. German intelligence correctly identified that the Soviets were aware of German plans and were preparing extensive defenses around Kursk. Reports described multiple defensive lines, extensive minefields, and concentrated armor reserves positioned to counterattack German penetrations. Some intelligence officers concluded that Citadel would face unprecedented defensive preparations and might fail to achieve its objectives. These warnings were acknowledged but did not alter the fundamental decision to proceed with the operation. General Walter Warlimont, Deputy Chief of Operations at the Armed Forces High Command, produced memoranda arguing that Germany's strategic situation required a fundamental shift from offensive to defensive posture across all fronts. Warlimont's analysis suggested that Germany lacked the resources to conduct major offensives on multiple fronts while defending occupied territory across Europe. He advocated for a strategy of defense in the east, combined with efforts to shore up Germany's position in Italy and prepare for eventual Allied landings in Western Europe. His arguments were largely ignored by Hitler and other leaders committed to offensive action. Communications between German generals and their Italian, Romanian and Hungarian counterparts reveal attempts to rebuild coalition forces after the disasters of winter 1942-1943. German officers worked to reorganize and re-equip Allied forces, though reports indicate widespread skepticism about their reliability. German planning increasingly positioned Allied forces in secondary sectors while concentrating German forces at critical points, an implicit acknowledgement that coalition partners could not be trusted to hold against serious Soviet offensives. The debate over Citadel also revealed tensions over resource allocation. Luftwaffe commanders argued for greater allocation of resources to air defense of German cities, which were coming under increasing Allied bombing pressure. Navy commanders advocated for more resources devoted to submarine warfare and coastal defense. Army commanders insisted that the Eastern Front must retain priority. These inter-service disputes consumed command attention and complicated strategic planning, with Hitler ultimately arbitrating between competing claims on Germany's limited resources. Field Marshal Günther von Kluge, commanding Army Group Center, produced detailed operational plans for Citadel that reveal both the sophistication and limitations of German military planning. Kluge's plans called for elaborate coordination between multiple armies, massive artillery preparation, and rapid exploitation by panzer divisions once breakthrough was achieved. However, the plans also reveal awareness of German vulnerabilities, with extensive contingency planning for Soviet counterattacks and concern about maintaining supply lines through heavily defended Soviet territory. General Friedrich Paulus, captured at Stalingrad, represented a unique case that complicated German military discourse. Paulus had signed statements critical of Hitler's conduct of the war while in Soviet captivity, though it remains unclear how much coercion was involved. German generals were aware of Paulus's statements through intelligence sources, and they created discomfort among the officer corps. Some generals defended Paulus's decisions at Stalingrad, arguing he had been placed in impossible situations by Hitler's orders. Others distanced themselves from Paulus, suggesting he had failed in his duty or broken under Soviet pressure. Communications also reveal attempts to learn tactical lessons from recent battles. German doctrine was updated based on combat experience, with new emphasis on anti-tank defense, improved coordination between arms, and techniques for defending against Soviet offensive operations. Training programs for replacement troops were modified to focus on skills most relevant to defensive warfare. These improvements were real and meaningful, but they addressed tactical problems while leaving strategic challenges unresolved. The question of whether Germany should seek negotiated peace began appearing cautiously and indirectly in some communications. No general openly advocated surrender, but some memoranda discussed the advantages of ending the war before Germany's position deteriorated further. These discussions assumed that Germany might negotiate from a position of relative strength after a successful operation like Citadel. The possibility that neither the Western Allies nor the Soviet Union would accept anything short of unconditional surrender was not seriously considered in German military planning. A significant shift in German military communications occurred as generals began acknowledging Soviet military improvements more explicitly. Earlier dismissals of Soviet capabilities as mere numerical superiority gave way to recognition that the Red Army had evolved into a formidable fighting force. This recognition came gradually and reluctantly, colored by ideological prejudices and professional pride, but it represented a fundamental change in how German commanders understood their enemy. General Hoth's intelligence summaries from mid-1943 described Soviet command and control improvements in detail. Hoth noted that Soviet commanders were employing operational deception more effectively, using radio discipline and camouflage to conceal force concentrations. Soviet offensive planning had become more sophisticated, with multiple simultaneous attacks, designed to prevent German forces from concentrating reserves. Hoth's reports, while still maintaining German tactical superiority, acknowledged that the Soviets were closing the operational gap. Field Marshal von Manstein's private correspondence with other generals reveals his evolving assessment of Soviet capabilities. Manstein noted that Soviet tank crews had improved dramatically, that Soviet artillery coordination had reached high levels of effectiveness, and that Soviet commanders were making fewer mistakes in operational planning. He observed that the Red Army was incorporating lessons learned from German successes, essentially copying German tactics while adding their own innovations. Manstein's tone suggested professional respect for a competent enemy, though tinged with frustration that German superiority was being challenged. General Heinrici's diary entries provide particularly candid assessments of Soviet military capabilities. Heinrici wrote with admiration about Soviet defensive engineering, noting the sophistication of fortifications and the intelligent use of terrain. He described Soviet counterattacks as well-timed and coordinated, often striking German forces at moments of maximum vulnerability. Heinrici also noted the improving quality of Soviet junior officers, observing that Soviet lieutenants and captains were making tactical decisions that their predecessors in 1941 would have been incapable of executing. Intelligence reports on Soviet equipment acknowledged the effectiveness of Soviet tank designs, particularly the T-34 medium tank. German officers had initially dismissed the T-34, but battlefield experience forced recognition that it was an excellent combat vehicle that combined mobility, armor protection, and firepower in an optimal balance. The KV-1 heavy tank and subsequent Soviet heavy tank designs also earned grudging German respect. Reports noted that Soviet armored vehicles were mechanically reliable, well-suited to Eastern Front conditions, and produced in numbers that German industry could not match. Discussions of Soviet generalship became more nuanced. While Hitler continued to dismiss Soviet commanders as inferior, field generals increasingly recognized that their opponents were skilled professionals. Generals like Georgy Zhukov, Konstantin Rokossovsky, and Ivan Konev were identified in German intelligence as particularly capable commanders whose operations demonstrated sophisticated operational thinking. German communications began treating Soviet offensives as serious military operations, requiring careful response, rather than as crude attacks to be easily defeated. The Katyn Forest massacre, where thousands of Polish officers had been executed, became a propaganda tool that German leadership attempted to use against the Soviets. Communications from German propaganda officials to military commanders emphasized using Katyn to demonstrate Soviet brutality and bolster the will to resist. However, the cynicism of this approach was apparent to many German officers, who recognized that German forces had committed similar or worse atrocities throughout occupied Eastern Europe. The attempt to weaponize Katyn in military morale efforts had limited effectiveness. Soviet partisan operations behind German lines became a subject of increasing concern in German military communications. Reports described effective partisan interdiction of German supply lines, intelligence gathering for the Red Army, and growing partisan control over significant territory behind German lines. German anti-partisan operations were absorbing substantial forces that were desperately needed at the front. Officers noted that harsh German occupation policies had driven population toward supporting partisans, but ideological commitment to Nazi racial policies prevented any moderation of occupation practices. Communications regarding Soviet prisoners of war reveal another dimension of German military thinking. Early in the war, German forces had captured millions of Soviet soldiers, many of whom died in captivity due to deliberate neglect. By 1943, as German manpower shortages became acute, there were proposals to use Soviet prisoners in auxiliary roles or even to recruit them as combat troops. These proposals generated intense debate, with some officers arguing pragmatically for utilizing available manpower, while others insisted that ideological principles prohibited arming Soviet captives. Hitler's general opposition to such measures meant that a potential source of manpower remained largely unexploited. The recognition of Soviet capabilities created psychological dissonance for German officers. Their professional training emphasized German military superiority, but battlefield experience contradicted this assumption. Some officers resolved this tension by attributing Soviet success to factors beyond Soviet control: lucky timing, German mistakes, overwhelming numbers. Others began privately questioning whether German victory was possible, though such doubts were rarely committed to paper and never openly expressed. The gap between official optimism and private pessimism widened throughout 1943. German assessments of Soviet industrial capacity underwent revision during this period. Initial estimates had underestimated Soviet production by enormous margins. By 1943, German intelligence recognized that Soviet factories, many relocated east of the Urals beyond German bomber range, were producing tanks, aircraft, and artillery in staggering quantities. Reports noted that American and British aid was supplementing Soviet production, providing trucks, radio equipment, and other supplies that enhanced Soviet operational capability. The realization that Germany faced not just the Soviet Union, but the combined industrial might of the Allied coalition was deeply concerning to German planners. The Battle of Kursk in July 1943 represented Germany's last major strategic offensive on the Eastern Front. German military communications before, during, and after the operation revealed the evolution of command thinking and the deepening crisis of German strategic position. The operation, repeatedly delayed as German forces waited for new Tiger and Panther tanks to arrive, ultimately launched on July 5, 1943, against Soviet defenses that had been preparing for months. Initial reports from the battlefield expressed cautious optimism. German forces achieved tactical penetrations of Soviet defenses, with some units advancing several kilometers. However, the rate of advance was far slower than planned, and German losses, particularly in armored vehicles, were higher than anticipated. Field commanders reported that Soviet defensive preparations exceeded intelligence estimates, with defensive lines extending far deeper than expected. Soviet anti-tank defenses proved particularly effective, with German tank formations suffering significant losses to mines, anti-tank guns, and concealed anti-tank strongpoints. General Model's reports from the northern pincer of the Kursk attack described intense fighting and stubborn Soviet resistance. Model noted that his forces were advancing but were consuming resources at unsustainable rates. After several days of combat, Model expressed doubts about whether breakthrough could be achieved before German forces exhausted themselves. His communications to higher command requested permission to halt the offensive if breakthrough appeared unlikely, representing a significant departure from earlier German confidence in offensive operations. Manstein's southern pincer achieved deeper penetrations, but also encountered unexpectedly strong resistance. Manstein's communications described fierce Soviet counterattacks that disrupted German exploitation efforts. Soviet forces were committing armored reserves in coordinated counteroffensives rather than being defeated in detail, as German planning had anticipated. After a week of combat, Manstein reported that while his forces continued to advance, the operation was unlikely to achieve its strategic objectives within acceptable casualty limits. On July 13th, Hitler met with his top commanders and informed them that Operation Citadel would be terminated. Allied landings in Sicily required German forces to be transferred to Italy, and continued attacks at Kursk were consuming resources without achieving decisive success. The decision to halt Citadel was presented as a strategic choice rather than an admission of failure. But field commanders understood that Germany's last realistic chance for strategic offensive success in the East had failed. Communications following this decision revealed disappointment mixed with relief that the grinding battle could end. The Soviet counteroffensive that followed Citadel caught German forces in vulnerable positions. Soviet operations struck toward Orel and Belgorod, driving German forces back, and threatening to encircle entire armies. German communications describe desperate defensive fighting as exhausted units tried to establish defensive lines, while Soviet forces pressed them relentlessly. The optimism that had surrounded Citadel's launch gave way to grim acceptance that German forces had lost the initiative permanently. Field Marshal von Kluge's reports described the collapse of the Oral salient, with German forces conducting a fighting withdrawal while under constant Soviet pressure. Kluge noted that his armies were suffering heavy casualties and that unit cohesion was beginning to break down. He requested substantial reinforcements, but was told that no reserves were available. Kluge's frustration is evident in communications, where he noted that his forces were expected to hold positions with inadequate resources against an enemy that seemed to possess unlimited reserves. The recapture of Kharkov by Soviet forces in August 1943 marked a symbolic defeat for Germany. This city, which had changed hands multiple times, was now firmly in Soviet control. German communications acknowledged that the front line was moving inexorably westward, and that each defensive line established proved temporary. The pace of Soviet advance had accelerated, and German forces found themselves constantly displaced from defensive positions before they could be fully prepared. Intelligence reports following Kursk revealed the extent of Soviet military expansion. The Red Army had grown to over 6 million men under arms, with thousands of tanks, aircraft, and artillery pieces. Soviet industrial production was exceeding German estimates, with tank and aircraft production particularly impressive. German intelligence officers noted that the material balance had shifted decisively against Germany, and that this imbalance would only worsen with time. German generals' communications increasingly focused on how to manage inevitable retreat. Discussions centered on which positions were worth defending at high cost, and which should be abandoned to preserve forces. The concept of mobile defense that Manstein had advocated earlier was now being adopted by necessity rather than choice. However, Hitler's insistence on defending every position complicated implementation of flexible defense, with field commanders frequently requesting but being denied permission to retreat. The human cost of Kursk and subsequent operations appears in medical reports and casualty statistics. German forces suffered hundreds of thousands of casualties in summer and fall 1943, including the loss of experienced junior officers and NCOs who were increasingly difficult to replace. Reports describe declining morale, increasing rates of desertion and self-inflicted wounds, and growing war weariness among troops. Officers noted that soldiers who had fought since 1941 were psychologically and physically exhausted, while new replacements lacked the training and experience to fight effectively. Communications from this period also reveal the strain on German family life and society. Officers received letters from home describing hardship, bombing raids, and growing desperation among the civilian population. These letters affected military morale, as soldiers worried about families they could not protect. Some communications discuss the impact of casualties on German society, noting that entire age cohorts of young men were being decimated and that the social consequences would be profound and long-lasting. From late 1943 through 1944, German military communications document a steady retreat westward as Soviet offensives pushed German forces out of Ukraine, Belarus, and eventually toward pre-war German borders. The tone of these communications evolved from tactical focus to strategic desperation, as generals realized that containing Soviet advances might be impossible and that Germany faced potential catastrophic defeat. General Heinrici's reports from late 1943 described defensive battles along the Dnieper River, which German propaganda had proclaimed as an impregnable defensive line. Heinrici noted that Soviet forces crossed the Dnieper at multiple points, establishing bridgeheads that rapidly expanded despite German counterattacks. His reports acknowledged that German forces lacked the strength to contain Soviet breakthroughs and that each defensive line proved temporary. Heinrici's tone suggested resignation to a long retreat, with focus shifting from winning battles to preserving German forces for continued fighting. Field Marshal Ernst Busch, commanding Army Group Center, produced increasingly alarmed reports about the deteriorating situation in Belarus. Busch described Soviet deception operations that concealed massive force concentrations, followed by overwhelming offensives that shattered German defensive lines. Operation Bagration in summer 1944 destroyed Army Group Center, with 28 German divisions annihilated in a matter of weeks. Busch's communications during this disaster reveal confusion and desperation as entire armies lost contact with higher command and were encircled. Communications between field commanders and Hitler's headquarters reveal growing friction over strategic direction. Generals requested permission to conduct strategic retreats to defensible positions, while Hitler insisted on forward defense and authorized retreats only when positions had become untenable. Field Marshal Walter Model, who replaced Busch after Bagration's disaster, sent increasingly blunt assessments to Hitler, noting that orders to hold positions were resulting in unnecessary casualties and the loss of entire divisions. Model argued for elastic defense and mobile reserves, but his requests for freedom of action were consistently denied or granted too late. The logistics situation deteriorated throughout this period, as documented in supply reports. German rail networks were under constant Soviet air attack and partisan interdiction. Fuel shortages limited the mobility of German mechanized forces, with some panzer divisions immobilized for lack of fuel. Ammunition expenditures exceeded production, forcing rationing even during defensive battles. Supply officers reported that maintaining armies in the field required stripping rear areas and cannibalizing damaged equipment, measures that provided short-term relief while accelerating long-term decline. German generals' assessments of the strategic situation became remarkably candid in private communications during this period. General Guderian, who had been appointed Inspector General of Armored Troops and then Chief of the Army General Staff, produced memoranda analyzing Germany's deteriorating position. Guderian noted that Soviet material superiority was overwhelming, that German industry could not keep pace with losses, and that the war in the East was essentially unwinnable. He advocated for seeking negotiated peace, while Germany still retained some bargaining power. His assessments were dismissed by Hitler as defeatist. Communications reveal interesting discussions about defensive strategy. Some generals advocated for defending forward positions to keep the war away from German territory as long as possible. Others argued for conducting fighting withdrawals to conserve forces, eventually establishing defenses at Germany's pre-war borders, where supply lines would be shorter and defensive positions potentially stronger. Still others suggested abandoning large portions of occupied territory to concentrate forces at critical points. These debates revealed fundamental disagreements about priorities and realistic German capabilities. The treatment of German allies in communications became increasingly cynical. Reports noted that Romanian forces were proving unreliable, with entire units surrendering to Soviet forces without significant resistance. Hungarian units were described as lacking fighting spirit and abandoning positions under pressure. Finnish forces were competent, but Finland was clearly seeking exit from the war. German planning increasingly focused on how to position German forces to control or, if necessary, suppress potential defection by allies. The deterioration of Germany's alliance system accelerated the military collapse. Reports on Soviet atrocities against German troops and civilians in occupied territories began appearing in military communications, though their purpose was complex. Some reports appeared to be genuine intelligence about Soviet treatment of German prisoners and civilians. Others were clearly intended for propaganda purposes to stiffen German resistance by emphasizing that Soviet victory would mean harsh retribution. The accuracy of these reports is difficult to assess, as German forces had committed extensive atrocities throughout occupied Soviet territory, and Soviet forces were indeed conducting reprisals in many areas. Air operations reports describe the Luftwaffe's collapse as an effective fighting force on the Eastern Front. German aircraft were outnumbered by factors of 5 or 10 to 1 in many sectors. Pilot training standards had declined as experienced pilots were lost and replacement training was shortened. Fuel shortages limited flight operations. Soviet air superiority meant that German ground forces operated without air cover while being subjected to constant Soviet air attack. Luftwaffe officers reported with despair that they could no longer provide meaningful support to ground operations. Communications also revealed the impact of the Allied bombing campaign on German military operations in the East. Resources that might have gone to Eastern Front operations were diverted to air defense of German cities. Industrial production of weapons and equipment was disrupted by bombing raids. Rail networks used to supply Eastern Front forces were damaged by strategic bombing. Some German generals quietly welcomed bombing raids as providing evidence that resources should be shifted from east to defense of Germany proper, though such sentiments were carefully expressed. The eastern territories that Germany had conquered and occupied since 1941 were now being liberated by Soviet forces. German communications reveal concern about the fate of ethnic German populations in these territories and the potential for Soviet retribution against collaborators. Some commanders organized evacuations of German civilians and collaborators ahead of Soviet advances. Though these efforts were often inadequate and chaotic, the human cost of Germany's retreat extended beyond military casualties to include massive displacement of civilian populations. One of the most fascinating aspects of German military communications during this period is the tension between professional military assessment and ideological commitment. German generals were trained military professionals capable of objective battlefield analysis, but they operated within a regime whose ideological assumptions shaped strategic thinking in fundamental ways. The communications reveal how this tension played out. Nazi racial ideology held that Slavic peoples were inferior, that the Soviet system was weak and corrupt, and that Jewish Bolshevism represented an existential threat that must be destroyed. These beliefs influenced German strategic planning from the beginning, contributing to underestimation of Soviet capabilities and resilience. As battlefield evidence contradicted these assumptions, German generals faced cognitive dissonance between their professional observations and ideological teachings. Some generals resolved this tension by compartmentalizing, maintaining ideological orthodoxy in political contexts, while making pragmatic military assessments in operational planning. Others began questioning ideological assumptions, though such questioning was dangerous and typically remained private. Still, others doubled down on ideology, attributing German setbacks to insufficient ideological commitment or betrayal of Nazi principles. These different responses created tensions within the German officer corps. Field Marshal von Manstein's communications reveal a primarily professional orientation, focused on operational and tactical considerations rather than ideological matters. Manstein's reports analyzed Soviet capabilities in military terms, acknowledging improvements in Soviet tactics and operations without attributing them to racial or ideological factors. However, Manstein also participated in the criminal aspects of Germany's Eastern campaign, with his forces involved in atrocities against civilians and prisoners. The compartmentalization between professional military work and participation in war crimes was not unique to Manstein, but was characteristic of many German generals. General Guderian's communications show similar patterns, with professional military analysis coexisting with acceptance of the regime's broader goals. Guderian criticized specific tactical and operational decisions while supporting the war's continuation. He advocated for improved tank production and better operational planning without questioning whether Germany should be fighting in the Soviet Union at all. The professional military focus allowed German generals to avoid confronting the criminal nature of the war they were conducting. Some communications reveal more explicit ideological content. Certain generals' reports included references to the necessity of destroying Jewish Bolshevism or preventing Asiatic hordes from overwhelming Europe. These ideological flourishes often appeared in communications intended for Hitler's eyes, suggesting they were included to curry favor or demonstrate loyalty. Whether the generals believed such rhetoric or included it cynically is difficult to determine from written records alone. The treatment of Soviet prisoners of war in German communications reveals the intersection of military pragmatism and ideological brutality. Early in the war, Soviet prisoners were deliberately neglected, with millions dying in German captivity. By 1943, facing acute manpower shortages, some German officers advocated using Soviet prisoners as auxiliary forces or labor. These proposals generated debate, with pragmatists arguing for utilizing available resources and ideologues insisting that arming Slavic captives was unacceptable. The resulting compromises satisfied neither pragmatism nor ideological purity. Communications regarding partisan warfare reveal the impossibility of separating military operations from ideological genocide in occupied Soviet territory. German anti-partisan operations routinely included mass executions of civilians, destruction of villages, and other atrocities that blurred the line between counterinsurgency and ethnic cleansing. German military reports on anti-partisan operations employed euphemisms that obscured the criminal nature of these activities. Officers described pacification of areas and elimination of partisan infrastructure, while avoiding explicit reference to the mass murder of civilians. The question of whether German generals should have recognized that their cause was both militarily hopeless and morally monstrous is complicated. Some generals later claimed they were apolitical professionals following orders. Others insisted they had privately opposed Nazi excesses while doing their military duty. The communications from 1943-1944 suggest that most German generals were aware of criminal activities occurring in occupied territories, that they participated in or enabled these crimes, and that professional military culture provided them with rationalizations for their complicity. The concept of military honor that German officers inherited from Prussian military tradition proved inadequate to the reality of the war they were fighting. Traditional military honor emphasized bravery in combat, loyalty to comrades, and professional excellence. This framework had no category for evaluating participation in genocide or war of annihilation. German generals could feel honorable while conducting military operations that enabled mass murder, a failure of moral imagination that allowed them to participate in monstrous acts while maintaining their self-image as professional soldiers. Communications from this period also reveal the extent to which anti-Semitism was integrated into German military thinking. Reports frequently blamed Jewish influence for various problems, from partisan activities to Allied strategic decisions. This casual anti-Semitism appeared even in operational documents, suggesting how deeply such prejudices had permeated German military culture. The Holocaust was occurring throughout occupied Eastern Europe during this period, and German military units were sometimes directly involved in or facilitated mass murder of Jewish populations. By late 1944 and early 1945, German military communications reveal a leadership that had largely accepted that military victory was impossible. The focus shifted from how to win the war to how to end it on terms that preserved something of Germany, though what exactly could be preserved remained unclear and contested. Soviet forces were approaching German borders, and the generals' communications reveal their awareness that catastrophe was imminent. Field Marshal Ferdinand Schörner, commanding various armies and army groups in the final years, represented a particular type of Nazi general who maintained ideological fanaticism alongside military competence. Schörner's communications emphasized the need for brutal discipline, ideological commitment, and fighting to the death. He instituted harsh measures against soldiers accused of defeatism or desertion, with military police hanging soldiers found fleeing from battle. Schörner's reports maintained that proper National Socialist spirit could overcome material disadvantages, a position increasingly divorced from battlefield reality. General Gotthard Heinrici, in contrast, focused on preserving his soldiers' lives while conducting effective defense. Heinrici's communications described defensive operations designed to inflict maximum casualties on Soviet forces while minimizing German losses. He advocated for tactical retreats when positions became untenable and opposed pointless last stands that would only result in his soldiers' deaths without strategic gain. Heinrici's more humane approach put him at odds with fanatical Nazi commanders and with Hitler's insistence on fighting for every position. Communications between German generals reveal discussions about potential negotiated peace, though such discussions were extremely dangerous given Hitler's opposition to anything resembling surrender. Some generals believed that a separate peace with Western allies might be possible, allowing Germany to concentrate forces against the Soviets. Others thought Germany might negotiate with the Soviets to avoid complete destruction. These discussions remained speculative and were never seriously pursued, partly because neither Allied coalition was interested in negotiating with Nazi Germany. Intelligence reports from early 1945 described the Red Army as an overwhelming force that German defenders could slow but not stop. Soviet forces had achieved numerical superiority of 3 or 4 to 1 in many sectors, with even greater advantages in tanks, artillery, and aircraft. German forces were exhausted, under strength, and increasingly composed of very young or old soldiers, lacking adequate training. Reports noted that many German units existed more on paper than in reality, with divisions at fraction of authorized strength. The communications regarding the defense of Berlin in April-May 1945 reveal the complete breakdown of coherent German military planning. Orders bore little relation to available forces or realistic capabilities. Phantom armies that existed only in Hitler's imagination were ordered to relieve Berlin. Exhausted units were commanded to conduct counter-offensives with non-existent reserves. Field commanders reporting that orders were impossible to execute were dismissed or threatened with execution for defeatism. The final communications from German military leadership describe chaos, desperation, and the collapse of the military organization that had conquered much of Europe. General Hans Krebs, the last chief of the Army General Staff, participated in final negotiations with Soviet forces in Berlin. His communications describe attempts to negotiate surrender terms, though he lacked authority to actually surrender German forces. Krebs's discussions with Soviet commanders reveal the gap between German hopes for negotiated settlement and Soviet insistence on unconditional surrender. The communications from this final period are fragmentary and chaotic, reflecting the disintegration of German command and control. Some German generals' final communications reveal concern for their soldiers' fate and attempts to surrender units to Western Allied forces rather than Soviet forces. Generals recognized that soldiers captured by the Soviets faced harsh treatment and likely years in captivity or death. Communications describe attempts to move units westward to surrender to American or British forces, though such efforts often failed as Soviet forces advanced rapidly. The concern for soldiers' welfare that appears in these final communications stands in stark contrast to the callous treatment of Soviet prisoners and civilians throughout the war. The question of what German generals learned from the experience of defeat appears in some post-war writings and interrogations. Many generals blamed Hitler for strategic errors, arguing that the Wehrmacht could have achieved better results with different leadership. Others blamed material factors, noting Soviet numerical superiority and Allied industrial production. Few accepted that German military aggression and criminal occupation policies had mobilized total Soviet resistance. The tendency to externalize blame and avoid confronting the criminal nature of the war they fought persisted among German generals even after defeat. Communications from the final months also reveal the disintegration of German society behind the military front. Reports describe refugees fleeing westward, collapsed civil administration, breakdown of law and order, and growing chaos as the Reich collapsed. Military units found themselves not just fighting Soviet forces, but trying to maintain order among panicked civilian populations. The complete collapse of the German state was evident in communications describing commanders making decisions about civilian evacuations, food distribution, and local government in the absence of any functioning civil authority. The communications and statements of Germany's top generals as the Red Army continued advancing after Stalingrad reveal a complex picture of military professionals struggling to reconcile professional competence with strategic failure, battlefield reality with ideological commitment, and personal honor with participation in criminal war. These generals were capable of sophisticated military analysis, yet they contributed to and enabled one of history's most destructive conflicts. The evolution of German military assessment, from confident predictions of victory to desperate improvisation, occurred gradually, shaped by battlefield defeats, but also by institutional culture, ideological commitments, and personal psychology. German generals acknowledged Soviet improvements, but struggled to accept that the Red Army might be not merely competent, but superior in operational art. They recognized Germany's deteriorating material position, but convinced themselves that German tactical excellence could compensate for numerical inferiority. They saw evidence that the war was unwinnable, but continued fighting because they could not imagine the alternative. The conversations among German generals reveal how military organizations can fail catastrophically while maintaining internal coherence and professional standards. The Wehrmacht continued to function as an effective fighting organization, even as it was being ground down by superior Soviet forces. German units fought skillfully and inflicted heavy casualties on Soviet forces throughout the retreat westward. This technical competence coexisted with strategic bankruptcy and moral catastrophe, demonstrating that military effectiveness and strategic wisdom are distinct qualities. The role of ideology in shaping German military thinking cannot be overstated. Nazi racial theories led to systematic underestimation of Soviet capabilities and motivated the criminal occupation policies that ensured total Soviet resistance. German generals were complicit in these policies, whether through active participation or passive acceptance. The Prussian military tradition that emphasized duty, honor and professional excellence provided no adequate framework for resisting participation in genocide. Professional military culture became a vehicle for implementing monstrous policies. The communications also reveal the human dimensions of military leadership under catastrophic circumstances. German generals experienced fear, frustration, exhaustion, and despair as their situation deteriorated. They worried about their soldiers, argued with superiors about impossible orders, and struggled with the knowledge that many would not survive. These human elements coexisted with their participation in criminal activities, reminding us that perpetrators of atrocities are not monsters from another species, but humans capable of compartmentalizing their actions and maintaining self-concepts as honorable professionals. What Germany's top generals said when the Red Army kept advancing after Stalingrad reveals that military organizations facing defeat go through predictable stages: initial denial and rationalization, grudging acknowledgement of enemy capabilities, strategic reassessment seeking ways to regain initiative, acceptance that victory is unlikely, and finally focus on survival and damage limitation. These stages played out over more than 2 years of continuous fighting, with different generals moving through them at different rates based on personality, position, and exposure to battlefield reality. The failure of German military leadership to recognize the impossibility and immorality of their cause earlier than they did resulted in millions of additional deaths and immense additional destruction. Had German generals collectively confronted Hitler in 1943 after Stalingrad or in 1944 after Bagration and insisted on ending the war, countless lives might have been saved. That they did not reflects the power of institutional loyalty, ideological commitment, personal ambition, and the difficulty of acknowledging catastrophic error. The generals' communications from this period serve as historical documents of profound importance. They provide insight into how military organizations think and function under extreme stress. They reveal the intersection of professional military culture with totalitarian ideology. They demonstrate how intelligent, educated professionals can participate in monstrosity while maintaining belief in their own honor and competence. These lessons remain relevant for understanding military organizations and civil-military relations today. The Red Army's advance after Stalingrad represented not just military defeat for Germany, but the collapse of assumptions upon which the entire Eastern campaign had been based. German generals' responses to this collapse, their attempts to explain it, adjust to it, and ultimately survive it, reveal the limitations of military professionalism divorced from moral framework and strategic wisdom. They were highly skilled at the operational art of war, while being catastrophically wrong about the war's fundamental nature and purpose. In the end, what Germany's top generals said when the Red Army kept advancing reveals that even the most professional military organization can be defeated when its strategic assumptions are flawed, when its enemy is underestimated, and when its cause is unjust. The Wehrmacht's technical competence could not overcome the Soviet Union's will to survive, its massive industrial capacity, and the justice of its cause in defending against invasion. German generals' gradual recognition of these realities came too late to prevent catastrophe for Germany, and too late to spare millions of lives lost in the war's final years.